We usually start with a moment of sort of meditative silence. And so I'll invite you, if you feel so moved, to close your eyes and take a breath, or just take a breath and bring yourself into this virtual space, this gathering of hearts and minds. We give thanks for gathering once more, this community of seekers and explorers of sacred texts and more. And we give thanks for our teacher and her spirit of inquiry and discovery. And with that spirit of gratitude, may we begin together. Amen. Okay, Sarah,
All
over to
right.
you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here once again. Always a delight. I'm thrilled. I'm very excited for today's session. We're going to be talking about some of my favorite stories of Jesus. I have many favorites, but the ones we're going to be talking about today are among the top for me. So, welcome again to Life of Jesus. This is our Lenten series exploring the biblical narrative and historical context of Jesus, the rabbi from Nazareth. And remember, we're not approaching this from the orientation of what historically actually occurred in these accounts. Are these accurate? Are these factual? Is this what Jesus really said? Is that what Jesus really did? We're looking at the narrative that was produced by the followers of Jesus, those who were in that time period, who were there present, passed down oral stories, and those stories were then eventually shaped into a narrative of who Jesus was, what his purpose was. And that narrative tells us about what they thought they were doing, what this Jesus movement was all about. So we're exploring those narratives together. And today we are talking about miracle narratives. So today is going to be about healings, demons, walking on water. We are looking particularly at two sections of miracle narratives. We're going to look at a section from Mark. We're going to look at Mark chapter 5. The healing of the demoniac. And then we're going to look at the second half of Mark chapter 5, which is a tale of two daughters, if you will, the healing of the woman with the hemorrhage of blood and the raising of Jairus' young daughter, who was seen to be dead. And then we're going to shift over to Matthew and look at two units from Matthew chapter 14, which are the feeding of the 5,000 men and the walking on water. And all of these narratives kind of take place around the quote unquote Sea of Galilee. It's not really a sea, it's a lake. And so just to orient us to where we are when we're talking about these narratives, all of these stories are happening in this region. If we're thinking about Palestine, thinking about this area that has been colonized by the Roman Empire and the Jewish people that are living there under that colonizing rule, this is kind of the layout at that time. Here is Galilee, that's the region that Jesus is from, and the Sea of Galilee is a large lake. And many of these stories that we're going to be taking a look at today happen around the series of Jesus crossing the sea. He immediately gets in the boat, crosses the sea, goes to the other side. And what's happening on the other side here is this is the Decapolis. This is the region of the Gentiles. This is where the Hellenized cities are, that it's the 10 cities, right, that were planted by the Greeks and then the Romans to try and Hellenize and colonize this region, right? And so here we have Jesus and his disciples doing a series of miracles on both sides of the Sea of Galilee, and he keeps crossing back and forth, and there's some tension in the crossing, right? So the whole narrative, as we'll see, Jesus starts out in his own land in Galilee. It kicks off in Mark chapter 4, really, the first thing that happens is they get in the boat to cross the sea, and there's a huge storm that comes up, and then Jesus calms that storm, right? We're not going to read that text, but that kicks off this series in all three synoptic gospels. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, if you recall, are the three gospels that follow the same kind of pattern. They do so in different ways. They have different details. They might order certain accounts differently or insert different pieces in different ways. But in Mark's account, which is the earliest gospel to have been written, probably around 70 CE, he kind of sets the pattern that Matthew and Luke sort of follow in a general way. And he kicks this whole narrative off, this whole series off with the crossing of the Sea of Galilee, the huge storm, Jesus calming the storm, and then we enter in Mark chapter 5, what happens when they get to the other side and they are over here, right? Here's a little close-up, Sea of Galilee, right? Here's where Jesus is from, right? And they spend a lot of time in this whole narrative going back and forth. And there's some question, we're going to meet this demoniac in a moment. Where is he from? It has a name of where he's from, but according to the text of where this story is happening, it's unclear as to, is that really happening here or there? The details are fuzzy, right, in this account. But this is a general idea of where they're at. He's probably over here, crossing over here. And this is kind of what the landscape looks like. So as we're reading, kind of imagine this is where they're at. This is what the surroundings kind of look like in a bit. This is the Sea of Galilee from the other side of the sea, right? From the Gentiles side. So, and with that, there's a lot of reading today. So we might not get through all of it, but we will do our very best. We're going to start with Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 20. This is the story of the healing of the demoniac. And its parallel accounts are Matthew chapter 8, verses 28 through 34, and Luke chapter 8, verses 26 through 39. So this story happens in those other two texts. The details are not all the same, right? In Matthew's account, there are two demoniacs. In Mark's account, there's just the one, right? So they're not in agreement. And remember, we're not here it's not about trying to be like, what's the true story? This is how the author of the Gospel of Mark chose to shape this narrative in order to communicate some kind of theological idea of who they were saying Jesus was. So with that, there are 3 slides with this pericope. A pericope is a story. It's a unit in a gospel, right? The pericope of the demoniac, it's this unit. And so there are 3 slides that we're going to be reading through. And so I see the first 3 people I see are Kimon, Barbara, and Mary. So Kimon, would you you'll read the first slide if that's all right. Barbara, when I click to the next one, could you take the next one? And then Mary Gaylord, you'll take the 3rd slide if that sounds good to you. And with that,
they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when he had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him any more, even with a chain, for he had often been restrained with shackles and chains. But the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke into pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones.
When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he had said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." He begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there on a hillside, a great herd of swine was feeding, and the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea, and were drowned in the sea.
The shepherds ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed and in his right mind. The very man who had had, who had had, is that right? The legion?
Yep, the legion. Mhm.
Okay. And they were afraid. Those who had seen what had happened to the demoniac and to the swine reported it. When then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged him that he might be with him. But Jesus refused and said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed.
Thank you. What do you feel? What do you notice? What comes up for you?
One thing that comes up for me is the local people who own those 2,000 swine must not have been too happy to lose such a huge flock of swine. I would think that Jesus might catch some flack for that. And is there any background to that we ought to know about?
Well, we don't really have anything in terms of like other characters in the story. Whose swine were they? That's not clear. It could be that the people that come and hear about what happened are connected to the owners of the swine. And that's part of why they push him out. There's also not really clarity. I mean, Mark has a tendency toward exaggeration, right? So he inflates the numbers. So there's a good chance that this is not intended to be a literal, I would say more than likely, it's not intended in Mark's telling to be a literal 2,000 pigs here. This is a herd of pigs. It's a lot of pigs, but we're going to get back to the numbers thing in a moment. Why would he inflate the numbers and what might that symbolize? And rather than it be this is a story of property destruction, right? What is the point of speaking about a large number of pigs, right?
What's interesting to me, they talk about pigs. So clearly it was going to hurt the Jews. So that was one of the issues.
Right.
Kind of, there might be a subtext within that too.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Exactly. This is very clearly trying to signify he's on the other side of the sea now, right? This is not in his community of predominantly Jewish people. He is on the other side of the sea, which is also, it's a colonized land, right? But it's Gentile colonized land. right? And so they're not following the same purity codes. They're still living under the oppression of the Roman Empire, but these are people that are living under oppression that are not Jewish people. And so you can see that in the lack of attention to purity codes, like the owning of swine and like the man living in the tombs, right? He is, you don't touch the dead, you don't live around dead things, you don't be in that presence, right? And so the setting here is like Jesus and his disciples are like in the farthest reaches of what would be comfortable. They're outside of what would be comfortable to them. They've crossed some kind of line of segregation, if you will, to be in a land that is outside of their moral and purity codes. So there's that.
But the pigs kind of seem to come back into the purity codes because they're suddenly possessed of unclean demons.
Right.
Really, I mean, they become the vessels of evil and are demolished.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and here's where we're getting to this point of what is the demon, right? What are these demons, right? So Jesus encounters this person who is clearly overcome by some spirit of evil. And it is common in biblical narratives for the idea of possession by a foreign spirit to signify oppression by a foreign entity. Mm-hmm. So we're coming into a land that's also another colonized land, and suddenly we start having echoes of colonization. The colonization that Jesus experiences in his land is also being experienced here, right? And so here's a foreign spirit of colonizing foreign entity that is causing harm here with this person, to the point that it's feeding back in on himself, right? And then Jesus, trying to interact with this man, tries to call that foreign spirit out of him and says, come out of him. And the person responds, go away from me, right? He's so overwhelmed by this oppression that he can't even deal with trying to get liberated. And Jesus asks him, what is your name, right? And this is a common approach to trying to have power over someone in the ancient Near East. If you know someone's name, you have some kind of, there's power. That's a common theme in exorcism literature of the ancient Near East, right? So here's Jesus asking what his name is, and the response is legion. This is a Roman military term, right? So here we have, again, occupied by a foreign spirit. Occupied, what kind of foreign spirit? Militarization. This foreign military entity is occupying this land, right? And Jesus sends that Roman military occupation away. This is a story of decolonization, sending away, right? And the legion tries to go into the pigs, right? Now, herd of pigs, the word for the group, collective noun here, is in the Greek, again, it's not an appropriate term for a collection of pigs. It's a term that is a military term, right? So this is about sending a militarized group away. The narrative of Jesus overcoming a military group, but not with violence, with this movement toward liberation and sending out the impacts and the effects that colonization has had on this person and then on this community. Now, what happens is that the people that come and hear about this, they see the impact of liberation on this person, this individual, and it's terrifying to them because there is this history in the Roman Empire of movements that seek to push out and repel Roman military occupation. The Roman Empire swarms back in and re-engages, reoppresses the people. And so there is hesitancy to try and engage in some kind of collective act of liberation, despite the impact that they see that this movement has had on this individual, this man who was so harmed. So there is this narrative going on here that Jesus is the work of this community is a work of decolonizing. It's a work of resisting militarization. And there can be consequences for that. And that's exactly what we see happens with the life of Jesus, the consequences of resisting militarization, the consequences of resisting colonization, military oppression. And he does that again, not by gathering an army himself, right? But by engaging with various communities and bringing communities together in solidarity. And here we have an example of a community that does not want to engage that because they know what the consequences might be for them.
Sarah, is the grammar as perplexing in the Greek as it is here? That phrase I stumbled on, the man who had the legion.
Right.
My
So it is perplexing. It's the spirit is named Legion, right?
Okay.
So it's a singular, right? But it is intended to be that this is the size of a Roman military occupation,
Mhm.
which by the way is 2000, right? So there's a connection here, right? This is a squadron. This is a legion of military occupiers that are coming into this land, and Jesus is sending them away, right? And then they flee through the pigs, and through, specifically in the narrative, through the 2000 pigs, right?
Sarah,
Yes.
I didn't know any of this, so it's fascinating. And I'll admit that when I've just looked at this text without reading commentaries and stuff, it does present an image to me of someone with demons of mental health or addiction or lots of human conditions. But are you basically saying that that would be an improper way to read the story?
I think it's a very common way to read the story. I think contemporary readers, modern readers, with our understanding of mental health, right? We often look at demon exorcism stories in the Gospels as examples of, these are individuals with mental health conditions, and Jesus is healing their mental health condition, right? Which I don't think is the proper way to read them in the context of what was happening at that time, right? And so
I actually didn't mean it that I just think of it as a metaphor, really.
Sure.
I wasn't thinking so much that this person actually had meant, but to me, it is an evocative image of, it's an evocative image.
of course.
But maybe that's just way too metaphorical a reading of the whole thing.
And it's really uncomfortable, right? We don't really like to think about, I mean, that's not in our current way of, it's not a modern way of looking at the world, right? And so a lot of times it's like, it's uncomfortable. We don't really know what to do with it. And so we turn it into this other metaphor that fits for us.
Yeah.
I think is fine. I think these stories can still be useful talking about mental health conditions, because that is, it's an important thing to talk about, right? We can use these texts to talk about that, but I also think it misses what the text was trying to do in that time.
Right.
So I think it's important to also explore that side, to say, what were they thinking expelling the demons was doing for them, right? And then see what kinds of parallels might come up around that understanding. Right. Lots of different ways to read these texts, and that's important to note, is that what is useful, how do we enter into these stories in a way that's useful and edifying to us and to our communities? One way to do it is to try and understand the original content.
So what translation of the Bible are we actually physically reading now?
We are reading the New Revised Standard Version, the NRSV, New Revised Standard.
Okay, so that's
Well,
pretty
Sarah,
minor.
the fact that this possessed person is able to break his chains, but he's suffering horribly. He's hitting himself with stones. But the fact that he breaks out of his chains, is that part of your liberation metaphor?
Yes, he's struggling with chains and he's trying to break free, but he's doing so in a way that, like, the colonization, the impacts of the colonization, the oppression he suffered just keep coming back on him, right? It's not a truly liberatory, the methods that he's using are not liberatory. And so here comes Jesus, and it's this communal shift that happens, and we still don't really understand it, right? This is one sliver of the narrative, right? And we can't really understand fully, I think, what's going on here without continuing to read through Mark, because Mark's building something. He's this narrative, this story does not stand by itself. It's building towards this idea of what is the movement of Jesus all about, right? And we see in this account the impact that it has on this individual who comes into contact with a group of people that are moving toward liberation together, and it releases him in some way from the ways in which he has been oppressed and harmed by the colonization of his own mind, right? The colonization of his community.
So your thesis really is that this gentleman is actually not a demoniac, but a political prisoner.
I would say that's a good way to read it. I would say that this is a narrative of political liberation, and that this person is representing, in Mark's narrative, remember in other narratives, there are multiple people that are demoniacs in the account. In this account, it's one person that's holding, I think, yes, metaphorically in the narrative, this idea of we are political prisoners, we are oppressed by this Roman occupation, the same way you are over on the other side of the sea, by the way, the same way the Jewish people and Jesus is experiencing oppression. The impacts are happening here too, right? And here's Jesus and his disciples getting exposed to that reality, that oppression is happening outside of their own borders, also by the forces of colonization.
Sarah, would you say, I mean, it seems that these stories of Jesus often talk about demons being in people and being freed of them. I mean, whether it be a young girl or this man or a lot of others, would you say that they're all symbolic pretty much of political power and people being oppressed, as opposed to so many people having demons that are, I mean, I've often wondered about how many people, all these different people that had demons in them in the Bible.
Right.
But would that be kind of a general symbol, would you say, or what?
I do read them that way, yes, because I'm reading them in the context of the larger movement that Jesus is creating of a different kind of world. He is establishing the quote unquote kingdom of God, right? And all these different, it's a way of living outside of the way of being of Caesar, right? And his whole system and the whole hierarchy, or the whole class oppression, everything that's happening in that system. There is this movement toward a different way of being. And there are, I think of the text in Ephesians, we struggle not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities and rulers of darkness in high places. He's coming in contact that this idea of these powers and principalities, these systems of oppression, racism, classism, patriarchy, all of these, it's the devil of patriarchy. It's the devil of these systems and ways of being that cause harm to humanity, right? Saying that our enemy is not this person, the enemy is these systems, and Jesus keeps coming up against them. So that is how I read them. I do read them as part of the narrative of liberation.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus is doing that work.
Very helpful.
We've got a lot to cover, and I love all these questions. I do want to get to, let's see. Yeah, let's just keep going with the ones that I picked out. So this is the very next narrative in Mark's gospel. So we start out with the crossing of the sea. The sea is in turmoil. They're crossing over away from their Jewish land and entering into Gentile-dominated land. And they encounter the demoniac. Now they cross back to the other side, right? And a great crowd is, so now they're back in a Jewish community, right? Back on the other side of the sea. And let's go with Gina, would you read this? There are 4 slides for this text. It's a long one as well. Would you read the first one? Sarah Andrzejak, would you read the second one? Cynthia, would you read the third? And Paula, would you read the fourth?
When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came and, when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well."
Immediately, her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down beside him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease."
While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him.
Oh, you're muted, Paula.
Sorry. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat.
Thank you. What comes up for you? What do you feel? What do you wonder?
I notice the anonymity. Don't tell them anyone, and who touched my cloak. So I'm struck by that.
And this seems in such contrast to the previous passage where he says, "Go and tell everybody what the Lord has done." So I don't get that.
Right. There's a lot of secrecy going on here.
Yeah.
In contrast.
Yeah.
It almost seems like this teaching is more about, for me, I've always loved this story about the hemorrhaging woman. And to me, it feels like a teaching that is a personal teaching for the individual to have faith and find their own relationship with God, rather than the hierarchy.
Absolutely. There's something very audacious about what she does, right?
Right.
Because here's a woman who has been bleeding for 12 years. Now, in this context, I mean, we hear that and we think, we're overcome by the physical ailment that we hear about, and, hear about her condition and how she's been trying to see doctors. She's been trying to do what she can, but she's poor. She doesn't, she's spent everything that she has, and she's in medical debt now, right? She has nothing. But there's also the element here that she's living in a world where bleeding makes you impure. If you go back and read in Leviticus, purity codes, she has no access to worship now, because as a woman who is bleeding, she can't enter the temple. She cannot come into the presence of God, right? According to the structure that she is living in. She is impure. She can't even be in the presence of a rabbi, right? And what she does is, despite all of that, she says, I believe that if I were to just touch the hem of his garment, I would be healed. And even though that could get me in some serious trouble, I'm going to press through anyway, right? And she goes and she does it. And she is healed, right? And now, what does that mean in the context of this narrative, right? Well, there is a verse in Malachi that talks about how God's Messiah is going to have the power of Yahweh, the power of God in his prayer shawl. So literally what's happening here is she is like, there's probably an echo in her mind of that text from Malachi saying, I think that's who this person is. And I'm going to go after God where I see God being. And she reaches out and she does that. And she touches him, even though in this system, the world that she's living in, like that, she is bringing shame on herself, and she's also making him impure. But what happens when he finds out that he has been touched by this woman? He doesn't rebuff her. He doesn't push her away. He colludes with her in the breaking of this purity code. He touches her and he calls her daughter. Now notice this is happening sandwiched in between the story of another daughter, right? Mark does this often, the sandwiching technique, that the story in the middle is intended to be interpreted through the context of the story that is surrounding it. So it opens with the synagogue leader coming to Jesus, hearing that he's a miracle worker, asking him to come and heal his daughter, his 12-year-old daughter, right? Who is very sick. And the synagogue leader is someone with power in Jesus's community, right? He is someone who is very strictly observing purity codes. He is the person that probably has turned away this woman for wanting to come and worship in the past. And Jesus starts out going with him, but he allows his journey to this place of power to be interrupted by this woman who would have been an outsider in her own community, and listens to her. And rather than first centering the powerful man's daughter, he centers this woman and calls her daughter. But he doesn't stop there. He resumes and goes to the Jairus's daughter and heals her as well, as if to say this movement is a movement of interrupting these class distinctions that we want to uphold through our purity codes, right? Your 12-year-old daughter who has lived in this place of privilege because she is in the house of the leader of the community is not more important than this woman who has been suffering for those same 12 years. And so we're going to heal together. We're going to do this. We're going to move forward. We're going to heal together. Right? Wow. So, and that's where the power is in this movement, right? We're coming together, right? And we're not letting what has divided us, like the sea that divided in the last narrative, that divided the Jewish people from the Gentile people. We're not letting our own class distinctions divide us.
Is the 12, I mean, the 12 is clearly a way of unifying those stories, as well as the word daughter. But I'm just curious about numbers now.
Oh yeah. 12. What else has 12?
Tribes of Israel.
Disciples.
Apostles.
Disciples.
The 12 apostles. And what else has 12?
And
Hebrew scriptures.
Uh,
The tribe, and how many tribes of Israel? are
12 tribes of Israel.
yeah.
Right.
Go, Stephen.
So we've got the 12 tribes of Israel. So this is the whole people, right? The covenant community, right? Jesus chooses 12 disciples to represent this is about the covenant community. And then now here is the author of the Gospel of Mark telling this story about interrupting class distinctions on the way to healing. And he explicitly names this as a 12-year story to talk about how it's important to interrupt class distinctions within your covenant community.
So we now have three stories. And one of the going across to the other side. Do you think Mark is presaging that the ministry of Paul, sort of reaching out to the rest of the world rather than just the Jewish people?
I think so. Now, Paul's ministry is happening around 50 CE. So Mark is writing after Paul's letters have already begun to be written and circulated. So Mark's writing in a world where those texts are already in existence, right? And Paul, apostle to the Gentiles, is very clearly in his letters all about setting up church communities that are integrated. He is all about there is no distinction between Jew and Gentile. We're worshiping the same God together in church. So that's already in the ethos, in the background, right? And Mark is writing in Greek. He's probably writing from Rome. So he's probably been to the Roman church that is explicitly integrated with Jews and Gentiles worshiping God together, and no one is being prohibited based on the purity codes that they follow. So Paul tells the Jewish people, you can still follow your codes, but you can't enforce the Gentiles. You can't force the Gentiles to come in and follow your same codes, right? Because we're worshiping God together, and there's not going to be a purity code barrier to that entry. Right. And so Mark is writing in a world where he probably has read the letter to the Romans. He's probably fellowshipped with Christians that are Jewish and Christians that are Gentile. And so there's a chance that is also echoing. And I keep saying Mark, but it's probably not actually Mark. It's someone writing in Mark's name. But with that, it's a great question.
I see the secrecy here.
Oh, the secrecy.
Makes really fear Jesus realizing that he could get in trouble for breaking the rules. And also, he doesn't really want the power. I want the Romans to know, or anybody to know really, that he can do these things.
Right.
So it's self-protection as well.
It is. There are a lot of different ways that people have interpreted this. Sometimes Jesus wants everybody to know, and sometimes Jesus doesn't want people to know. There are different ways that people understand it. I'm looking at the fact that before, in the last story, he was ministering in an area that's not his hometown. Who's going to come and get him, right? They're over there, right? Now he's in his own land, right? And people know him. And he has just had the audacity to touch a woman that had the issue of blood. And then he took the little girl by the hand, and she is supposedly dead. So he just touched a dead girl. So he's breaking purity codes. And that's something that, he could get in a lot of trouble for. So I interpret this as him recognizing, you know what, I'm on the edge here. I got to try and be smart in this moment, because there's a good chance if people start hearing about what I'm doing, the end is going to come sooner than I think it should. And he knows that he's going to die. I mean, you see this throughout all of these accounts. He keeps saying, this is going to end with me being killed, right? But he's trying to navigate that world of still doing the work he knows he has to do, and do it for as long as he can, right? I want to do, we are running low on time. I want to get to one more story. So here is the story of the feeding of the 5,000 men, right? We often call it the story of the feeding of the 5,000. He's the feeding of the 5,000 men and an untold number of other women and children, right? So here we are switching over to the Gospel of Matthew now, Matthew chapter 14. This account is paralleled in Mark. So if we were to keep reading in Mark, what we would find is there's a little bit of a break, and then it goes back to this story. So there's a break that Jesus encounters rejection in Nazareth. He starts sending out his disciples to go and preach. And then John the Baptist is beheaded by Herod. So there's a state killing of Jesus's close friend and mentor, right? So he sees what has happened to someone that he was a follower of. And so now when Jesus heard this, that's what Jesus just heard. He just heard that his mentor has been assassinated, right? So with that, I want to say there's 2 slides for this one. So Kim, would you read the first slide? And Janet, would you read the second?
Now, when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat."
They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children.
What do you notice? What do you feel? What comes up for you?
He really gives up his own time to grieve in order to continue his teaching.
Yeah. There's this constant wrestling that you see when you read through the Gospels of Jesus trying to find some space to pray, right? Find some space to process, to reconnect, and the difficulty of balancing that is a common theme that you see in the Gospels. And what you're going to see is that after this account, if you were to keep reading, he sends the disciples back over to the other side of the sea again, right? We've got another sea crossing. They cross the sea so they can get away. They don't end up getting away. He sends them back across the sea after this feeding, and Jesus stays there by himself to pray. Right. So he postpones his own grieving, like you say, but he does still prioritize that and make time for that after this.
Again, the numbers come up in this for me.
Right.
5 loaves, 2 fishes, 12 baskets,
Mm-hmm.
5,000 men.
Right.
And from what
Uncounted of the others.
Right.
Right. And I would suspect that they are metaphors for other things.
Right.
I mean, again, the 12, that one's clear, but the 5 loaves and 2 fishes, I'm curious about.
Mm. So you put the 5 and the 2 together, you get the number 7. That's often used in biblical narratives as some kind of number of completion. You've got enough. You've got the fullness of what you need, right? Is the narrative here. And the 12, again, representing most likely the covenant people, right? The covenant community. And so what they had was enough for the whole covenant community. Now, what do you notice that is not here? What is absent?
Nothing to drink.
Nothing to drink. That's true. That is true.
Well, Sea of Galilee is fresh water, so that's
Jesus doesn't really say much.
He doesn't really say much. And, the narrative doesn't really say much about where did all of the surplus come from, right? I was raised to read the text as this is a miracle because somehow 5 loaves and 2 fish multiplied magically to be enough for everybody. But the text doesn't actually say where all of the resources came from. And you can almost imagine this, the people have seen the generous compassion, they've experienced community together in their time with Jesus, and they've come to commit to one another and care for one another. And they see the disciples and Jesus offering up out of their resources what they have. And it's almost like I imagine in the breaking of the bread and the sharing, suddenly everybody else that has something notices that others don't have something. And suddenly everybody is putting their resources into baskets together to make sure that everybody in the community, everybody in the crowd has enough, right?
The potluck.
It's a potluck, right?
Stone soup.
So this is an example where you're having the denying the sort of physical miracle of physical entities and going against the laws of nature rather than the laws of medicine and psychiatry. But so why do you think that's a distinction? Why can't you just have the fact that Jesus has control over the physical world as well as over the mental and physical health of people?
I think you can. I think that there's space in this story and in the context of everything else that Jesus does to read this a little bit differently, right? Or to kind of read between the lines here, right? Because it doesn't explicitly say power went out from Jesus like it does in these other narratives. Power went out from Jesus and this woman is healed, or this girl comes back to life. In this narrative, it's almost like it's intentionally vague, right? Of how did everybody have enough, right? It's almost like the story is designed, it's set up to make you ask that question, like, because it doesn't provide an explicit answer, right? And so that's kind of, it's the way I read it. I think that you can absolutely read it the other way. But given the fact that this whole narrative has been so far, Jesus breaking boundaries, right? We've seen the breaking of the boundary of some kind of segregation between Jews and Gentiles. We've seen the boundary of purity codes being broken, that kind of class distinction. Now, all of a sudden, there's the breaking of some kind of economic barrier, right? The barrier to entry into this community. It's you don't have to have enough resources in order to be part of the community. And so somehow everyone is provided for. I see this, I read this as a miracle. This is the miracle of the use of mutual aid, right? And that the community sees what the other needs and responds and is willing to give up of oneself, right? So the disciples, we have 5 loaves and 2 fish, but they're for us, but they give it up, right? And so I wonder what that might have meant to the rest of the community that saw that happen and how suddenly the spirit of generosity started spreading.
There's a echo for me. He says, all right, everybody sit down, takes the bread and he prays. He looks up to heaven. It's almost like the Last Supper.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. This, I think, is a foreshadowing of communion. And I think it's designed to be a way to interpret communion, right? I think that you read those two narratives together, right? The breaking of the bread with the 5,000 men and the breaking of the bread with the disciples, of what it means to be in community and what that action actually does when you take communion, what the commitment is of entering into this sacred community together, right?
Mhm.
I
We- I'm-
was- Oh, I'm
Janet,
sorry.
you have one more thought, and then I'm afraid we're going to have to close because it's almost 1. Janet?
Well, I was struck also by the similarity to give us this day our daily bread.
Mm-hmm.
And the symbolism of that being that obviously it's not literally bread, but it is the faith.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if in a way this story could be seen symbolically, that they were fed by his presence, by his power, and what he had to give them in terms of his spirituality and his ability to help convert them.
Mm-hmm. I do think you can read it that way, particularly when you consider what he gave. Like he was in a space of grief, right? And yet he felt compassion and listened to that compassion. Now we can have conversations about the importance of self-care and when is it appropriate, right? To say, okay, I'm going to put aside what I need right now for the sake of my community. But there is that reflection of him. He's willing to set aside that to engage in community.
Right.
Community then spreads through this, everyone being fed. And how is everyone fed? Well, people are giving what they have to be in this shared space together. And then after that, Jesus does go away to pray. So it's this, I think, invitation to ask yourself what you have to give in your community, right? And how to make sure all are fed. But I do think that it's important to name it as it's physical, because Jesus keeps centering the body and keeps centering physical needs. He saw that people were hungry and he responded to people's needs, their physical hunger, right?
All right, we have to leave it there, but Paula, do you have a word to see us out here?
Well, I do, and I will say one word. I wrote this ahead of time. So, a short prayer. Great Spirit, what sacrifice is worth our land, our homes, our life? Most of us would say none and avoid the road that led there. Today, I speak of one whom we study, an example, one of many who believed that you did not want sacrifice of any kind. And yet, he knew that living as he did would put him directly in line to be sacrificed, to die way too young. I ask you, why, Lord? When is there a time for sacrifice? I give thanks for every mystery you put to me, though they will never be solved, yet I gladly explore them. Amen.
Amen.
Very lovely.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you back here next week if you can come. And bring your friends. Thank you, Sarah. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, great meeting.